to the public lecture of the Faculty of Humanities today, with our speaker, Professor R. Philip Buckley from McGill University, Canada. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Mutiara Kasih and I'll be your host today. First of all, I would like to welcome our esteemed guest, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Indonesia, Dr. Bondan Kanumuyoso, the Vice Dean for Academic Research and Student Affairs, Dr. Untung Yuwono, Manager for Research and Community Engagement, Dr. Herito Sandi Pratama, our speaker, Professor R. Philip Buckley, our moderator, Dr. Harni Kartika Ningsi, and all of the participants. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start with the first agenda, let us watch the safety induction video of this auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, now we will first hear the opening remarks from the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Bondan Kanumuyoso. Dr. Bondan Kanumuyoso, the floor is yours.
Respected guests, Professor Philip R. Buckley, the Vice Dean and Managers, Faculty of Humanities, lecturer and students, and the participants of the public lecture. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is with profound pleasure and great honor that I welcome you a lot to this distinguished public lecture at our Faculty of Humanities. Today we are privileged once again to host Professor R. Philip Buckley from McGill University, marking his second visit to our faculty. His first lecture in December 2023, titled The Foreign, Strange and Mysterious World of Children, left a significant impact on our academic community, and we are eager to dive deeper into this insight with today's discussion. Professor Buckley's current lecture that will deliver this afternoon, titled Translation, Truth and Meaning in the Humanities, promises to further enrich our understanding of translation, not merely as linguistic act, but also as a fundamental and philosophical human activity. His approach invites us to reconsider our approach to knowledge and his dissemination across different culture and linguistic barriers, asserting that all activities in the humanities can be seen as a form of transaction. This aligns perfectly with our goals to deepen and diversify our understanding of the humanities in both local and global contexts. As we delve into the concept presented today, I encourage everyone in this room to reflect on how these ideas can influence our approaches to research, teaching, and engagement with the broader community. This lecture represents a key component of our ongoing effort to challenge and expand the intellectual horizon of our faculty and students. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Manager for Research and Community Engagement, Pak Sandi, and to all of the community members who have worked tirelessly to organize this event. Thank you also goes to our moderator, Ibu Harni, who will guide us through today's session, ensuring a fruitful and engaging discussion. Thank you, Professor Buckley, for sharing your profound insight and sparking what I'm sure will be a vibrant and enlightening dialogue. We are grateful for the impact your lecture will have on our academic community and beyond. Let me also take this moment to express our hopeful anticipation for the future. This afternoon, before this public lecture was to be held, the Faculty of Humanities held a discussion on research and academic collaboration with Professor Buckley and also the Vice Rector of McGill University, Professor Christopher P. Manfredi. The relationship between the Faculty of Humanities at Universitas Indonesia and McGill University has been immensely fruitful, and we look forward to nurturing this partnership further. We are excited about the possibilities of ongoing academic and research collaboration that not only enhance our respective institutions, but also contribute to the global academic community. May our joint efforts continue to flourish, bringing about innovative solutions and deeper understanding across cultures and disciplines. Let us move forward together in the spirit of knowledge, understanding, and shared exploration. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for the welcome speech from the Dean of Faculty of Humanities. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to our main agenda, which is the lecture from our speaker, Prof. R. Philip Buckley from McGill University, Canada, who will deliver a topic on translation through and meaning in humanities. This session will be led by Dr. Harni Kartikaningsi as the moderator, and will be followed with a Q&A session. Our moderator, Harni Kartikaningsi, is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at the Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Indonesia. She graduated from Sydney University with a Doctor of Philosophy in Linguistics. She got her bachelor degree from Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia in English Language and Literature. She did a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She has been giving lectures and delivering workshops on educational linguistics in Indonesia and beyond. Among others, Australia, Chile, Hong Kong, Iran, and was appointed as Director of Academic Writing Center, Faculty of Humanities, Universitas Indonesia, 2020-2021. Her research interests, all informed by systemic functional linguistics, include classroom discourse, genre pedagogy, healthcare communication, and multilingualism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Harni Kartikaningsi.
Hi, can anyone hear me clearly? Yes. All good? Great. So, I'm going to be the moderator. That means that the role that I'm going to play, I'm going to, give you the structure of this public lecture, as well as giving the time for the whole public lecture. But first of all, let's us invite Professor Philip Buckley to sit just right next to me, get a little bit of preparation while I'm going to read the slide. While everything is going to be set up, let me just give a bit of structure of this public lecture. So we're going to start, I'm going to start to read Professor Buckley's bio, and then I'm going to give you a bit of rules of this lecture. I'm sure all of you, I'll see some faces from the philosophy department as well as those who are non-philosophy department. We're going to be having a little bit of intellectual adventure, I think, because it's not just interdisciplinary, it's not just we're going to meet some meeting points of differences in different fields, but we're going to talk about it and engage intellectually. So that's exciting. Beforehand, let me read our honorable guest short bio. So Professor R. Philip Buckley is a member of the Department of Philosophy at McGill University, Montreal, Canada, and holds the McGill UNESCO Chair in Global Asia and Humanities. He was chair of the Department of Philosophy from 1998 to 2008, and of the Department of East Asian Studies from 2014 to 2019. His fundamental research is interesting. It's focused on the phenomenology of the Searle and Heidegger. Professor Buckley conducts research related to the interface of religion, culture, and identity within the context of a phenomenological understanding of the individual and community. From 2003 to 2012, Professor Buckley headed a McGill-based Canadian International Development Agency bilateral project focusing on capacity building in higher education in Indonesia. So we see the relationship with our country here. And several times he has been guest professor for a full semester at various universities in Jakarta and is an adjunct professor at the UIN Jakarta. And at the moment, Professor Buckley is working on themes at the crossroads of European and Asian philosophy. He also has an ongoing research interest in the specificity of Asian identities in global context, and a long-standing interest in the way in which phenomenology in particular, and the humanities in general, can contribute to the conceptions of quote-unquote health, care, and human flourishing. Wow, that's a lot. And we're going to hear him talking today. So, Professor Buckley, we'll be having you for around 50 minutes, 50, yes, around that time. I can be generous to the time. Thank you. Okay. But I'll be giving you a note, a little bit of note, 5 minutes before just to get you ready. So everybody, let's welcome Professor Buckley.
Okay. Let's set up here properly. Is that okay? That's better, I think. Okay, that's great. So I hope everyone is understanding me and at least hearing the words. And we'll talk a little bit about how much translation you have to do to take my English words into yourself. That is a little bit the topic today that we're going to think about together. But first of all, thank you for coming this afternoon. It's wonderful to be here for my second opportunity to lecture at the Faculty of Humanities at Universitas Indonesia. And it's just a pleasure to meet my colleagues again, the Dean, always very gracious, the Assistant Deans, my colleague in philosophy, Pak Sandi. It's very good to get to know him and the department well, but indeed the whole faculty. And we have many common interests. I'm a philosopher by training, but sometimes philosophers think they can do everything. Well, I don't know. But we do have broad interests. And we're always interested in sort of basic structures. And that's what we're going to think about today, is a basic structure of how things become, remain, and are communicated as meaningful to us. So that's really what we're aiming at today. So thank you for coming, and thank you for the introduction. And I must say right away, I have been a visiting professor this past semester at CUHK. So I have been yeah, we're connected. So without saying too much more, let's maybe get started. So why would I pick a topic like this? Well, one reason is, of course, that I wanted to do something that might be of interest across the humanities and across different departments. here in your faculty. So that's one reason I picked something like translation. As I understand, you know, departments of linguistics, interested in different aspects of translation, perhaps. And indeed, maybe that's one thing I'm trying to bring out today, is how we're always translating. So sort of the omnipresence, the constant task of translating that goes on in any sort of meaningful activity. So it's giving translation a very particular, I would say, broad and basic function in human comportment, in communal formation, and in activity. So that's one reason. I think another reason is, of course, my own personal experience of being here. So when I come to Jakarta, and I have been coming to Jakarta for quite a while, I have to do a lot of translation, or people have to translate for me. And so I'm constantly in a sort of interesting position of trying to figure out the meaning of what's going on around me. Now, sometimes that requires just simple, what I'm going to call simple or very basic natural language translation. Someone has to explain to me in English what I don't understand in Bahasa Indonesia. Right now, part of what you're doing, I would assume as native Bahasa Indonesia speakers, is you're translating. For those of you who are very fluent, you're probably translating relatively unnoticeably because your English is very good. And I know from my previous lecture, I was amazed at how good the English language is of the students. So thank you very much. But perhaps you're just still learning, and everyone can become better. So you may be actually having to do some translation work in your head. And in one way, we're always thinking about that when we're communicating. What did the person say? And that's sort of at a, let's just say, an objective level. What were the words that this person said, and how do they come across to me in Bahasa Indonesia? But of course, that's only one level of translation. This is going to be a talk with a little bit of philosophy in it. So you're also going to be translating, okay, I think he said this in English, but what does it mean? What do those words mean to me? And for that, no sort of mathematical or algorithmic translation yields that. Something else has to be done for you to understand what I mean. And that something else is what I want to talk about today. What is it, how is it that we actually come to share meanings? Not just particular constructs, but deep meanings. And my argument today, again, is that this can be understood, this communal sharing, this intersubjective sharing of meaning can be thought about as a translational activity. Okay? So this is kind of the orientation of this general talk. So again, because I'm often displaced in this foreign world, I think about translation a lot. And untuk jujur, saya bisa sedikit bahasa Indonesia. So tidak harus selalu berpikir itu apa. Tapi kadang-kadang ada situasi menarik. So kemarin saya di bandara baru di Jogja. And ada panggilan untuk pesawat. So saya selalu dengar. And you know, saya belum belajar itu jelas, tapi saya coba. Itu pesawat saya. Tidak. Ya, itu pesawat 777 tujuan Jakarta. So saya mengerti itu. Dan ada panggilan lain. Itu apa? Itu apa? And then I hear something like TTT. Itu tujuh. And hanya terakhir mereka bilang maternal one. Maternal one. And so, itu bahasa Jawa. I'm so surprised. A kind of public announcement, and I've been coming to Indonesia for a while, a public announcement in Japanese. And I'm very happy to hear that, because I have a tremendous interest in linguistic diversity, linguistic pluralism, and linguistic preservation, which I think is something that many of you in the humanities are probably interested in as well. So that was really interesting. But then I can see that I'm at different levels of translation, and because I know very little, bahasa Jawa, maternal one, Mongol, sorry, saya bisa bilang Mongol. But other than that, I don't know much. So very, very weak translation, but I can kind of tell where they're making the reference to the actual flight. And so even with very little basic information, you can start to translate a little bit. So again, this is an interesting question, I should say, is how much information do you need to get close enough to actually say, yeah, I kind of understand. There's something meaningful for me there. And indeed, even with a little bit of Bahasa Jawa that I know, there was something meaningful there for me. Why? Because I'm interested in linguistic preservation. And one of the issues in many, many countries is that national languages tend to dominate over local languages. And there's a very good practical reason for that. But it means that there's tremendous language loss. So that we lose something of the diversity of linguistic contexts. And this is everywhere in the world. Again, my experience in Indonesia is just always causing me to think about translation, and then you give me the opportunity to try and write something out and express it to you and share with you, and hopefully receive commentary and critique from you about this idea. Now, I do some actual translation work myself in my philosophical life. And that is largely from German to English. So right at the moment, I'm translating a number of texts that one of the philosophers I work on, Edmund Husserl, wrote and published in the 1920s in a Japanese journal. But this creates a very interesting, maybe this is why translation is on my mind. I'm just finishing the translator's introduction. And it's a bit complicated, because it's a very complicated linguistic triangle that I'm dealing with. So these essays by Edmund Husserl were not published primarily in German. They themselves were translated to appear in a Japanese journal called Kaizo in the early 1920s. So this is already interesting. You have this German philosopher. He had a number of Japanese students. Many Japanese students went to Germany to study in the 1920s. Continuation of the Meiji kind of internationalization of Japan. And they wanted Husserl to write something especially for Japan. So Husserl wrote these 5 articles, and the first one was published in German and Japanese. So in a kind of double translation, or double text version, which sometimes you see when you're dealing with text. You'll see the original and you'll see the translation on one stage. Very expensive process to print. So the second and the third articles, they were only published in Japanese. And then the fourth and the fifth articles were never published at all because the 1923 earthquake put everything in backlog in Tokyo. So the result is that these essays are literally unknown in the West. Written in 1924. They were finally published in a collected critical edition in German in 1989. And so I'm translating those and some other papers of Husserl that are lesser known, but I consider very, very important papers because this important German phenomenologist is giving his view on community, on culture, on European culture, and its relationship to Asian culture. So this is very little known. So I'm very excited about this translation. But of course, it's hard work. And it's hard work for many reasons, because it's not just the translation of philosophy, which is hard. It's the translation of philosophy in a different period. So for example, now we are all very concerned, rightfully so, about Eurocentrism and issues around a kind of Eurocentric approach. And there are things Husserl says in this paper which sound very Eurocentric. Europe is the culture of science. And Japan is trying to imitate it. So that sounds like a recipe for Eurocentrism. But in the articles themselves, Husserl is not very Eurocentric. In fact, he basically proclaims the death of Europe. He says Europe is dying because it's become a merely technological culture. In other words, the meaning of being a scientific culture is no longer readily accessible. And in some ways, he wrote this article, and he says this explicitly, but maybe the idea of Europe can live on in Japan. And so by Europe, he doesn't mean anything geographic. He means the idea or the ideal of a particular type of rational society. So somehow when I'm translating Husserl's words that are going to be read by English speakers who are interested in phenomenology, I have to be very careful. I can't, even with simple words, let alone loaded philosophical terms, I can't avoid the sense that they're going to be reading it now, not in the 1920s. And so I have to, in some sense, take that into consideration in my translation in order to make sure that what I consider to be a meaning of Husserl is translated properly in the context in which it's going to be read. So it means that translation work is actually quite challenging, and much needs to be done when you're doing that. So it's been on my mind, kind of both actively, but a philosopher is always doing what they're doing and then thinking about what they're doing at the same time. And I think maybe that's true of all academics. Another reason I'm so interested in translation, now again, and this is all a broad introduction to try and get us to start thinking about translation more broadly. So I went to this conference last year in Hualien, in Taiwan, where they're just having all these earthquakes now on the east side of Taiwan. But it was on food. So again, this is the good thing about being a philosopher, is you get invited to speak about everything. And someone asked me to speak about the philosophy of food. And I saw on this conference there were going to be many good dinners. So I said, I will come. And the food was excellent at this conference. So, of course, if you have a food conference, you have to have good food. And it was really about Taiwanese food culture. And there were many, many interesting lectures about the history of various aspects of Taiwanese cuisine. But one fellow, a very distinguished historian at the University of California at Berkeley, gave a wonderful paper. So it just shows what you can do in academic life. He gave a paper on boba. Everyone likes boba. When I go to Taiwan, I am a walking advertisement for boba. I love it. I love it. And he gave a very interesting lecture on the history of tea production. You know, so what we think of as tea was not tea 300 years ago. You know? And tea is one of the most ancient foods because it really grows out of a kind of soup culture. And boba is in some ways a translation and a recreation of that. You put the tapioca in it. But he brought it right up to date. And one of the things he was really stressing was how important boba culture is now for young Asians in North America. Because it's something they're really proud of. And it's become kind of cool. You know? So when boba first started, you know, I think some people started a boba shop 20, 30 years ago in New York City. And it became a kind of cool place for young Asians to hang out, who themselves were translated from out of an Asian context to an American context. And then it became kind of the cool drink for young, cool Americans in New York City. And so food is a very interesting example of translation. It gets taken from place to place. Many Indonesian foods, which you would say, oh yeah, itu 100% asli Indonesia. Nope. Datang dari luar. Translated. Brought here from somewhere else. And so food is just another way to think about translation. You're often engaged in a translation, or without knowing it, partaking in a previous translation that you might not know about. So that's just another reason I'm particularly, you know, interested in translation. I am doing, and I understand there are some translation experts here in the room, which I was worried about because I'm not a translation expert. I look very, very much forward to your critique and comments on this. But I am doing a little bit of work with some translation theorists in Hong Kong. Gilbert Fong, a very well-known translation specialist. He was at CUHK, but now he's at Hansam in Hong Kong. And just very interested in how translation studies is undergoing a sort of change. So this is another reason. And then the philosophical background, which I won't go into today, is really Heidegger. So Heidegger is someone who plays with language. This German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, plays with language in his texts in a very interesting way. And so, for example, his concept of truth, central concept in philosophy, his concept of truth, he thinks the notion of truth, as it's used in everyday German, doesn't capture what he wants to say about truth. So he brings a Greek word, aletheia. So aletheia is a Greek word for truth, maybe, maybe not. Philologists go crazy. They think Heidegger is nuts. You know, this word doesn't mean that if you take it strictly. But he says, but hidden in the everyday understanding of the word is something much richer. And it corresponds to what I'm thinking about as truth, as unconcealment. Truth is not some sort of absolute correspondence. It's about the unconcealment of something. And this is Heidegger's fundamental notion of truth in being in time. And so, and interestingly enough, so he's translating the notion of truth. And in order to do it, he actually has to translate a word. And he does a kind of etymological discussion of aletheia in being in time. But again, most strict philologists say, forget it. That's not the history of this word. But Heidegger is saying, but there's another history. I can give another history of this word, another narrative. So here you start to get into conflicts about translations, even. So these are some of the core points that I think are sort of motivational for my talk today. Okay? And maybe that loosens up a little bit our idea of translation already. But to do that a little further, I'll continue now with really the first part of my talk, which is to think about what I call everyday translation. So this is the abstract I've sent to you. So I really want to think about translation in this context of meaning creation, maybe, or meaning recreation or renewal. So the translation, again, is not something that is just one-to-one mathematical activity. And this notion also underlines the idea of a better original and merely a translation, which is deeply embedded in the way we think about translation, particularly in philosophy. So I know when I finish publishing these German texts, there'll be many reviews and they'll say, Buckley is crazy. You cannot translate this German term with this English word. And then we'll begin a debate. Because there is this sort of obsession with the original. And one of the things I'm trying to do, actually, is try to understand why we have that obsession and whether it makes sense, actually. And this is, of course, highly controversial in many fields. And so in this, in addition to my phenomenological background, I'm probably introducing a little bit of a post-structuralist, postmodern sound to my understanding of translation. So in this first part, though, phenomenology as a philosophical movement always says, let's begin with the everyday. Let's not start with a theory of translation. Let's just look at the everyday and see what sort of activities are going on and how we might describe them and structurally analyze them. So I'm going to begin with what I would call everyday examples, but I'm going to do that at two levels. So there's a famous psychologist, Maslow, who says, human beings have higher needs and lower needs. We have spiritual needs and we have very bodily needs. We have to eat. So I'm going to begin with kind of thinking about translation maybe at the higher level and then come back to the lower level. And I'm not sure they're as distant as we sometimes think they are. So let me give you an example of a translation in the way I'm starting to try this is a translation. So everyone knows it's Borobudur. Right? So, and I'm very, very pleased because as Bapak Dekan said, you know, we just had meetings with the Vice Rector of McGill University. He's been coming to Indonesia for a long time. He's never been outside of Jakarta. And I'm saying, colleague, you don't know Indonesia at all. You know, you can think Indonesia sama dengan macam. You know? So I was very happy to have the time to take him to Borobudur, to see something in Central Java that is kind of very core to the history of this place. At the same time, though, its core, can we say 100% asli? Well, depends what you mean. But it's certainly a translation. So agama Buddha datang dari luar. So it's been translated. It's been brought across somehow and put into a new context and a new environment. And I think that's a most interesting form of translation. So it became a meaningful way for people in Indonesia at the time to think about their own environment, even though it comes from the outside. And you start to think about maybe even our notion of inside and outside is somehow not quite appropriate. Because you appropriate meanings, and meanings become deep to you, even though they may be translated across from another culture, another place, or another person. And this is what we want to start to think about. So Borobudur is a translation, right? In many respects. So it's not only a translation of a religion from one place to another, it's a translation of Buddhism, which is already a translation of Hinduism, right? So there are multiple translations going on at once. But of course, Borobudur is even more than that. It's also a translation of various sutras which tell the life of the Buddha. Right? So it's a translation, it's an architectural or sculptural translation of a linguistic text. So there's another translation that is at work in Borobudur. So when you're standing in a rich historical place, you get this sense that you're just standing in the midst of layers and layers of translation activity and translational activities. So this is something that we really want to try and stress and bring about. So these are texts, and you know, I simply went on Google to try and find these texts, and the first one that came up was this one on the left. And only when I looked, I was just looking at, you know, Buddha Sutra scrolls. This comes up. Okay, I'll use that in my talk. Then I noticed it's in Chinese. So it's a translated Buddhist sutra into China. Of course, Buddhism had this great translation history from India through various parts. So we have all these different branches of Buddhism. And then we have, of course, the development of Chan Buddhism in China, and its translation into Zen Buddhism in Japan, which is remarkably different than the Buddhism that the Buddhists who built Borobudur would have been familiar with. So these are all layers and layers of translations, always at work. So here's a different type of Sanskrit text. So in a way, again, when we think of translation, I want to think about this type of translation from an actual text to a sculptural translation. That's a translation. And so the wonderful people working with this beautiful stone in Borobudur are translators. They're translating and making meaningful, again, in a new context, something that's, in a certain sense, from another origin. But they're re-presenting it, they're re-originating it. And in that sense, they're creating something new in the translation. And this is what I really want to stress in translation. Now, I mentioned the food conference in Taiwan. It was in Hualien. So I'm going to go to another set, what I would call religious translations. And these might, again, just interest you as well. So here is another translation of various things. So people recognize this. This is Bunda Maria. I guess we would say. But this is Bunda Maria in China, or in Taiwan, I should say. So in the middle of the countryside, there's this statue of Mary. So she's been brought from Europe. She took a long journey to get here, or to Taiwan, and has been brought across, and is meaningful for the people of this county, because the people in this county, there was a large Dominican foundation, which is still there, actually. This is the Basilica in Pingtung County in Taiwan. Very few Catholics in Taiwan. But this part, this village is 90% Catholic. And so this sort of translation of a particular religious structure, with its iconography, is very, very important for the people there. Now, one thing you can ask, is this a good or bad translation? And I'm not really necessarily asking that in an ethical or social or against the background of colonialism. I'm really asking is this statue of Bunda Maria a good translation? So we can ask that, even if we're undermining this one-to-one algorithmic understanding of translation. And in my own view, and that's just my view, so that again there can be conflicts about translations. In my own view, this is not such a great translation. This is 100% orang bule. And, you know, Bunda Maria, however she looked, dia bukan bule. So she's from a different culture, but she's been translated into European culture to look like this. So that's fine. That's a translation. That might be a meaningful statue for someone in, you know, Flanders, but not necessarily in the very south of Taiwan. At least this is a way we can think about how do we evaluate translations? How does this new activity of recreation work in a particular context? So that's what we want to look at. Fortunately, in Taipei, there's a very interesting museum of religious art. And there I saw something that I found a better translation. So here's Bunda Maria. Tapi Bunda Maria here is orang China. And baby Jesus is also orang China. This, to me, is a much better translation. So that would be the argument I would make. Because I think the meaning of the statue is more deeply connected to the everyday life of the people who sculpted it and to the community within which it's embedded. So this, I think, is a very interesting translation. Maybe to bring my two examples of Borobudur and statues of Mary in Taiwan together, this is in the same Museum of Religious Art in Taipei. And I really like this translation. So this is Mary and baby Jesus, but it's Mary as the Buddha of compassion. So now Mary is being translated as Buddha. This is magnificent. This is magnificent. I think this is really trying to say something. It's saying something more. It's saying something else. And it's good because it's not better than the original. There's nothing wrong with the statue of Bunda Maria from Europe in a European context. But in this new context, I think this is powerful for someone who might be Buddhist and remains Buddhist, but they can get some sort of sense of the spirituality of this particular work of art because Mary is portrayed as the Buddha of compassion. So this, I think, kind of warms us up to many aspects of translation, even at the highest level, our spiritual existence as religious beings. So my last slide in this section is just a question. And we can talk about it later in Q&A or not, if you don't find it an interesting question. But could we say this? So these are Wali Songo. So these are the great translators. Do you agree or disagree? You don't have to answer right away, because this is a complicated question. So, but isn't it interesting to think about the translation and translation history of Islam in Indonesia? This is something that I think a talk like today can at least open up discussion of these various forms of translation. Okay? So that's kind of a warm-up at one level of translation. But, of course, not every day are we in, or every moment are we encountering a religious temple like Borobudur. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, or two, or three. I've been many times. But every time I'm amazed by this translation. But in everyday life, too, we have many opportunities for translation which we may or may not notice. So now I want to come from this very high level to a very low level. Well, maybe I shouldn't use higher or lower. A different level. A different level. Maybe I was very influenced by Borobudur, where you go up to Nirvana slowly. But now I want to come back down to the very first level of Borobudur, and I'm going to talk about something we all have to do every day and we encounter. And that is go to the toilet. So, see, philosophers can talk about anything. And this is something that I've thought about in terms of translation. So now you're wondering, philosophers are truly strange. But let me try and show you how this relates to translation. So now we're on to what I would call lower needs. And the lower needs are this. If I am in a bar in Montreal, and I have to go to the toilet, WC, I look for an indicator of where I'm supposed to go. If I'm in Montreal, because we're a bilingual city, but the majority is French speaking, I'm probably going to see a sign on the door, Homme, Femme, Prière, Juanita, something like that. So that's an indicator, and I have to understand that meaning. So if I'm not a French speaker at all, I might have to ask someone to translate for me so that the proper meaning of that sign comes across. Sometimes, because again, Montreal, where I hope everyone has a chance to visit someday, we're a bilingual country, city. Sometimes the signs are bilingual, so we have a lot of bilingual signs. In different ways in Quebec because of certain language laws. So English must always be smaller than French. So you might see something like this, homme, and then men. Femme, woman, femme. But this is an issue. So where do I go to the washroom? We think it's very common. But when you're traveling in particular, but maybe even you've had this experience in Indonesia with different types of signs, you don't know. You don't know. So here's a way that I think universally we've been trying to deal with this translation problem of toilets, is we make pictographs. Right? So I began this research just a few months ago, but now every time I go to a WC somewhere, I'm looking at how do they convey the meaning of men and women. So you come across some very funny ones. So this is a very elegant lady, you know, and very elegant men. And it's supposed to indicate the washroom. But you know, you could translate that very differently. You could think it's a toilet, a WC, but you may think, I have to get dressed up, you know, to go to the washroom. Because much more is said than just male washroom, female washroom. So pictographs themselves don't always work immediately in some way or a sense to translate a meaning across. So I think universally, we've gone to more standard pictographs. Men, woman. But I kind of say, is this absolutely self-evident that this is a man? I mean, could be, and we've come to learn it contingently as that, but it's not self-evident. And here too, yes, if you're in a culture where women wear dresses, this is some sort of universal indication of dress. But what about another culture where women don't wear dress. How do we translate? So again, when you start looking at pictographs, they often have both natural language, men and women, and some sort of universal symbolization. But notice now that we've got complicated translation context. You have pictures that have to be translated and natural language that has to be translated. But as you know from traveling or looking around, these signs become more and more complicated every day for various reasons. So I've seen signs like this. Restroom. Here we have universal men and women, but you know, there's quite a divide. So how do I translate this? And it's a restroom. So here is where we go to rest. Istirahat. Itu literally in Indonesian, this is kamar istirahat. It doesn't say anything about going to the washroom. But we know it's a restroom. So there's another translation afterward. And we know it's for both men and women if we understand these pictographs. And we know that they're going to be separate. So there's a wall between them. So you can feel safe going to this restroom. Right? But then you start seeing signs like this. Now here, perhaps they just forgot the wall. But if I see this, I start thinking, well, I know it's a washroom, but do I have to bring a partner with me? It looks like they're holding hands, you know? So is this some sort of other type of space? Well, I know not. But I have to do some work. I have to do some translational activity, usually very quick, that this is a washroom, and then I'll go inside and see what's going on there. What could possibly be happening? But then you start to see even more signs. So how about this one? I think this one says, okay, ada tempat untuk laki-laki, ada tempat untuk wanita, and saya harus pergi. Itu harus cepat, huh? It's a very funny sign, you know, and I'm not exactly sure why it's translated this way. Then you get more abstract signs. This must have been an artist. This is a man, this is a woman. I'm not really sure what that means. Or this is something I found in the Hong Kong Cultural Center. You know, these are supposed to be easy translations. Now the translations, I think, are getting worse and worse, actually. You know, what's this? This is a man? This is a woman? This is a little child? You know? I mean, you can kind of figure it out, but now I have to take 10 minutes before I can go to the washroom. Am I going to the right place? So I actually consider these bad translations in a particular sense. And then only later on, when you go to a single washroom and you see this, am I confirmed that this is a man and this was some sort of, you know, multi-use toilet or washroom. And then, of course, today you get all sorts of different washrooms. So, a gender-neutral washroom. So this means, okay, now I've got to do a lot of work too. So what is this? Men? I guess so. Women? I guess so. This is gender neutral. Now, in fact, this pictograph doesn't look very gender neutral to me. I think it's a very bad translation of gender neutrality. But that's how it's being used. So these are actual signs. And so you start to see the tremendous contextualization of every translation. And I stress this because, again, if we have the idea that translation takes place due to some sort of mathematical, algorithmic formula, it never does. It never does. It's deeply embedded in the social cultural context at all times. And then sometimes people just get playful. I sort of like whatever, just wash your hands. You know, this is kind of woman, this is kind of, who knows? Mermaid, centaur, but whatever you are, whatever sort of being you are, just wash your hands, okay? I think this is a very good response. This is a good translation in some ways, even though it's far away from Priya insight. So let me just conclude with a few take-home points from this. So one thing I want to say is the conveyance of meaning in translation is never certain. So all these pictographs, they're trying to make something absolutely certain, but there's no guarantee. When I'm translating Husserl and Iso articles now, as I mentioned earlier, there's no guarantee that they are going to be read in the way I want them to be read, and what I think Husserl means as I struggle with his texts and try to render them into English in an appropriate manner 100 years after they were written in very old-fashioned German. So this is something. And so I've come up with this phrase. Maybe you can help me refine this a little bit. It's not about good or bad translations, maybe about success. And success is getting somewhere in the ballpark. So we use this expression in English. You know, a ballpark where people play baseball is very big. You know, and we use that, well, you're somewhere in the ballpark, which means it's not exact, but you're around the right place. You know? So this may be one way to think about translation. And again, this may upset our demands for rigidity and exactitude, but I think it's actually much more natural that this is the way we convey and share meanings. It's never one-to-one. When your best friend tells you their most important secret, it's never one-to-one. You have to translate it and sometimes say, I don't understand why you're so worried about that. It has to be a big secret. You know? That's a question of translation in some way. Secondly, I'd like to stress the reader of the translation is part of the translation activity. So it's not something that ends when the translator finishes their work. You are always part of a translation activity. It could be reading a translation in one of your areas of study, but it can also be in discussing that translation, and then maybe being curious about the language it came from and trying to learn that and talking about it. Or maybe you already know that language and you're thinking, that's interesting. Not quite how I would translate it. And that becomes a new space of meaning creation, where we discuss the meanings together in some way. And of course, that is, in a certain sense, an infinite activity. It doesn't end. It's part of the joy of human existence, is that meaning doesn't get exhausted in one translation. It has to be translated again and again and again in different contexts. I've also stressed that translations are heavily contextual. They don't correspond to some sort of universal algorithm, but are based on historical, cultural, locational contexts. And I think this is very important because it allows a space for us to continue to think about shared meanings in a sort of universal space that nonetheless does not eviscerate or destroy local contexts or local meanings. So, as you all know, this is one of the great concerns in universalization or globalization, is that specific cultures, contexts, languages, meanings get globalized to such a way that they lose their location or their locality. And here we really want to stress that this sort of way of thinking about translation always maintains location. And a final point I'd like to make is maybe a sort of philosophy of language point, is I was very interested in the way pictorial and natural linguistic, or natural language signs work together. So you have the picture, and then you have the myth. And I think one of the things this does is it shows how embodied language is. Language itself is not just some sort of abstract entity. It takes place in a very concrete, embodied way. It's written with a particular style. It's written in a particular way. And even if you translate the language, the linguistic structure directly, you may not catch the meaning. You know? This is the type of thing that happens very frequently. So, if I say to you in English now, something like this. Saya senang sekarang. You're kind of thinking, I don't understand what he's saying. He sounds terrible. But if I say, saya senang sekarang, McGill didn't like that. Because body language is part of our linguistic structure. And therefore, it's part of the translational activity. And so when we start to think about language in its richness, when we start to think about how body language and natural language fits together with grammar and so on, this is something that I think we can learn from thinking about and broadening our sense of translation. So those are a few take-home points. Mungkin kalian senang sekarang saya sudah selesai. Mungkin capek, mungkin lapar, mungkin haus. Sedikit haus. So thank you for your attention and being here with me and thinking about these issues, which I hope have some relation to your personal life, to your studies here at UE, and to your research interests. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Buckley. We are all charmed, I guess, because a philosopher essentially has this kind of paradoxical charm. So a philosopher usually knows how to just talk about anything, really anything, from the everyday to common sense, into something that really challenges us to think about our everyday outlook of life. And I think we think hardly now about translation, not just about something to do with language, but something to do with what we see in a sense than every day. So I think this is time for question and answer. I'll be having two sessions. I guess I'll be opening for 2 questions at the moment. We've got a few hands raising. All right, okay. From this side first, please. Yes. I need some help. Yeah. And then, sir, in the middle. Yes.
Pakai na aja nih. Pencet aja ini. Ini aja pencet. Oh, sana dulu. Bisa ada pencet.
Does it work well?
Itu
You can
dipencet
always push
aja.
the button. There.
Check. Okay. Thank you, Professor, for the very interesting lecture. My name is Raihana. Actually, I am the alumni of Faculty of Humanities, majoring in Arabic Studies. And now I will pursue my master's degree in the University of Melbourne on July. So, I have two questions. First one is, why do you think of the statue that is entitled to certain religion is captured depend on the culture on the land which the religion was spread? For example, like the statue of Mother Mary. And the second question is, why do you think it will give? Do you think it will give sort of different visual appearance, and eventually let people's mind to the wrong historical evidence of the actual visual form? For example, like the Mother Mary statue. Well, it depends on the area of the statue was showed. So that's my question. Thank you.
So, if I understand what I think are two challenging questions, and what's very funny is, I think you asked a question last time I was here, and it was also very challenging. So I'm getting to know the people at UI, and I know I have to be really sharp. So thank you again. So if I understand the first question, it was really about the translation from one place to another of a religious form, but the question was about kind of the appropriateness of that.
Actually, the first question is, I am asking your opinion. Why do you think that statue that is entitled to the religion is captured depend on the culture of the land? And the second one, do you think also your point of view that if there is a different form or visual appearance in different area, it will lead to the people's mindset about the wrong historical evidence of the actual visual form?
Those are two really interesting questions. So the first one is, so in a certain sense, why does it work in a different cultural context? And this is where you tend to think, well, there's got to be some sort of universal form behind it. And by that, I don't necessarily mean a religious belief, but there's something about motherhood. There's something about motherhood and the importance of that, which is somehow universal. And so people understand, that in different ways, and it's many religions, it's sort of connected to a particular religious context and so on. So its success might be dependent, but this is probably the issue I'm trying to say. It's not like there's a universal that comes first that's empty and formless, motherhood, and then it gets translated in different ways. But it's the other way around. There are individual cultural expressions of motherhood, which interestingly enough can be shared, often with great success. So I think that's part of the story. It's the translation of religions does somehow point to some sort of universal, but it does it in a way that doesn't eviscerate local variety and diversity. And that's what particularly interests me. So again, it's not as though the translation of the statue of Buddha Maria equals motherhood. It's clearly a Christian icon. but somehow it's interesting to people, just as you don't have to be a Buddhist to be interested in the positions of the Buddha. You don't, so it can be, in a certain sense, beyond sort of doctrinal or creedal commitments, and nonetheless meaningful. And I think that's one thing that's really interesting. These different types of translations can be meaningful at different levels, in different ways. Is it meaningful differently? Probably. Probably. Again, for that you have to go out and actually talk to, Taiwanese Christians or Indonesian Buddhists. Is it different than Buddhism in other parts of the world? Yes, it is. It is. But it doesn't mean it's disconnected. It somehow says something still. Somehow, in the middle of the Javanese jungle, di hutan Jawa, the person who said, "Here we will make Borobudur," felt something. And what he felt, itu dari Jawa. But what he translated it into was Agama Buddha. And so again, you see this kind of mix of cultures and contextualizations, which are probably at work in every single translation. And, is it a successful translation? I know I'm very impressed every time I go to Borobudur, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I think it's a marvelous structure, and I feel something special there. So in that sense, it's successful. So thanks very much. This is very, very interesting sort of indigenization of religions and so on. So thanks again. Good to see you.
Before we proceed to the next question, I would like to welcome another honorable guest, Professor Christopher Buckley, Prof and Executive Vice President of McGill University. He's here with us. Thank you, Professor Manfredi. I hope I pronounced your name well. This is the first time. Thanks. That's good. All right, let's proceed to the next question. There's,
Good afternoon, my name is Dante, and I am majoring in philosophy right now, in my second year. Actually, I want to ask something really particular right now. I see that you are really influenced by Heidegger, okay? But the thing that I want to ask is, I do really have the same interest with Heidegger, but regarding here, what I see is that you actually already pointed it out, which is the term of appropriation.
In terms of?
Appropriation,
yeah.
That term, yes. But here, what I want to ask is that, yeah, of course, I've read that appropriation which came from the act of assertion that came from his present at hand. And also, that's the interpretation that I read from Robert Random, if I'm not mistaken. But what I really want to ask is that this is actually a question regarding the task of translator and linguist, which is if linguist and translator hitherto has adhering to a particular task or a particular virtue where they see like the aforementioned Wali Songo, where they see that when they translate this a particular thing, they see that they are like the thing that you said before, a kind of metaphysical distinction that you said about mere translation and an original one. That I see from that you want to try to give a new understanding, which there is no really a distinction between those two. And then what I want to ask is that those Wali Songo and the translator in history has hitherto adhering to a particular virtue where I'm translating because I am going to a particular proximity nearing to the original. But now, because of this kind of explanation, it seems that this kind of original thing or the original object is not there. Like we cannot achieve it epistemologically. So what I want to ask is that what is it that you suggest for a task of linguist or maybe a translator, that what a virtue that those people must do when they are translating like that?
Thank you very much. Again, and I know there are, because you have a translation program here and so on, and also because many of the humanities are focused on translation, I don't want to give concrete advice, but let me try and contextualize it in a little comment on your first comment. It is true that in a talk like this, you sense my Heideggerian impulse, and maybe even my more Derridian impulse. So, as Jacques Derrida, who's actually very close to Husserl and Heidegger in some ways, but often misread as some sort of crazy deconstructionist, he's not. But he does have this wonderful term, there is an origin, but the origin is supplemental to the tradition it instaurates. So that is, every origin is only accessed because it started a tradition. And from the very beginning, it's already, in some sense, moved away. So there's no escape from translation of an origin, but at the same time, what we're translating is not the origin. We're retranslating it, always. You're never at the origin. You're always a product of an origin, which itself is a product of the tradition you stand in. And so there's a constant new origin. But that's why rich traditions live. Because those origins are re-originated all the time. And there's no better example of that than religious texts. They live because they are reread again and again and again, and they vivify and revivify the life of individuals. So when you read sacred scripture, you live again, and it lives again, in a new way. Not exactly in the way your parents experienced it. And so sometimes it has to be, and this creates a lot of tension, sometimes say around religion in the family. You learn the religion from your parents, perhaps, but then you start to say, but you know, I actually prefer this interpretation. No. This is the religion. Right? I think this is where translation becomes a challenge, because we tend to be kind of univocal in our demand. This is the original, or this is the only possible representation of the original. But I think the whole structural dynamic, just the phenomenological analysis of how we read and write, shows that this isn't the case. Something else is going on there. So I appreciate it very much. And in a way, what sounds like, oh, it's not important whether there's an original or not, I'm trying to push it in the exact opposite direction. The original is really important because it's a new original every time it's a new origin. It re-originates. It recreates. So that's kind of a general response. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
So I think I'm going to take one final question. Well, yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Alinda Huta Barat. I was graduated from a university in Taipei of China, majoring in Chinese translation and interpretation. It's good to be here back in the University of Indonesia, and thank you for your very enlightening lecture. I have one question, and my question would be on the Husserl and the Japanese written text or scripture. I used to research or analyzed based on political discourse. So it's something new that I have to analyze Chinese texts based on philosophy. You mentioned earlier about the pastoral and the Japanese written scripture on the concept of kinkai. I'm not sure whether it's the correct way to spell it pronounce it in Japanese, but in Chinese it's kinkai. And you also mentioned, elaborate on three things that should be followed to get something new as the value of the analysis, for example, the local cultural context. Could you please elaborate more on the two other things? The first one is the meanings or the universalism. And the second one is on the particular style. What does it mean and what does it represent? Thank you.
So again, thank you very much. And can you tell me again which university in China you just...
National Taiwan Normal University.
In, where is that again?
In Taipei.
Oh, not NTU, yes, so I know it quite well, actually. And so, very interesting. And of course, you introduced this more complicated linguistic framework, where of course you have a character-based language. Right? So this is particularly challenging, I know. I think I can say a few things just briefly about these kinds of articles, these renewal articles that Husserl wrote for Japanese journal. They were published in 1924. And so one of the things that's been a real joy in working in this translation project is we're also retranslating the Germans into contemporary Japanese. So the 1924 translation into Japanese by Japanese philosophers is viewed by present-day Japanese philosophers as not very good. Right? So I think this kind of points to something about universality and particularity. So I think one of the things they're saying is they're using a particular style of Japanese of that period in 1924 that is no longer philosophically appropriate. And so they're having the same task, even though these articles already have been translated into Japanese. They have to be retranslated as well. And so we're doing this at the same time for publication. So a kind of new edition of the Japanese version and an English edition, both based on the German critical edition of text. So, I mean, what does that say? These are 3 or 4 or 5 dramatically different contexts. You know, you have German, 1924 Husserl, writing in a certain way about Europe that's no longer appropriate unless you explain it. You have the way that got translated in 1924 Japan. The Japanese consider it problematic now. So it has to be retranslated. I'm trying to render it into English. And in doing so, we go back and together we've discovered places where we just have to say the original, the German, is terrible. It's just not clear. I mean, you have a lot of people from a lot of philosophical backgrounds working in 3 different contexts, thinking about all these issues around how you translate into contemporary language. And you go back to the German original and you just, now I don't really understand what Husserl means. Right? That doesn't mean we have to say something, but we're kind of guessing. We're laying it open. But I think that points towards some sort of universality. You know, we know there's something going on. And whether it's my Japanese colleagues, or me, or my German colleagues who are helping me with this task as well, We all understand something like this test. But at the same time, we're trying to render them into particular situations which capture something in that universal sense. But we're not pretending there is just one sense. And that somehow, if you read all our different translations, you'll get it better. Maybe you'll just get more confused. We just want to be successful in rendering a text that opens up discourse, that opens up new possibilities, and that opens up perhaps new translations. A translator in some way shouldn't be offended when people say, well, we could do this differently in some way, shape, or form. Actually, to tell you the truth, I've had a lot of help on this. So I prepared the translation first, and I submitted it to the Husserl archives in Berlin. They, without telling me, on purpose, they had a semester-long seminar on it. And they just worked through it without telling me. And because they didn't want me present. Because they were fearful, because people are going to debate this translation. Then they invited all the people who were members of the seminar, and they invite me to a little bit, and then they lay it all on me, you know, in a very nice and philosophically profound way. And, you know, at a certain point, no one ever says you were wrong, but this may be pushing it in too normative a direction. This is not a normative claim by Husserl. This type of thing. And I think that's kind of a universal share, but from particular perspective. So maybe that's some sort of general response to your question.
Okay, so that final question will conclude our public lecture and question and answer session. So just to say thank you is kind of underplaying what we have been doing today. So we've been discussing on translation, truth, and meaning in the humanities. And I do hope that everyone is here feeling challenged to question what the everyday and the common sense we have, you know, been surrounded by every day. And this philosophical adventure, especially for those who are non-philosopher, linguists by training, I'm very much challenged and see things quite differently. And I think that's going to be a good outtake for our intellectual adventure for this evening. So thank you very much for our guest lecturer today, Professor Buckley. Let's have a round of applause. Thank you also for Professor Manfredi, Dr. Untuliwono, and Dr. Sandy for having us here. And I'm going to conclude my role here as the moderator and